Right. All right. So now we have moved on to a file called Car Lighting Start. This is a model of a Mitsubishi Evo that I picked up for free about 5 years ago. I think it was originally a Blender file, but now it's in Maya. And so we're going to use this to practice lighting. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to talk about cameras. Next week, we're going to talk about animating cameras, and we might go into a little bit more detail. But I want to give you kind of a general overview of how to start playing around with them. So, by default, we don't have any cameras in our view, or in our scene. We just have our perspective view, which is a nice approximation, but we don't have a ton of control over that. So I'm going to go to Create and Cameras, and I'm just going to choose the default camera. Here it is in the scene. It looks like a camera, which is helpful. By default, it is called Camera 1. And I'm going to go to the Attribute Editor, and we've got a bunch of options. So we'll take them one at a time and hopefully start to make sense of this. What's also going to be helpful, though, is I'm going to split my view here. And on the left panel here, I'm going to set the perspective to Camera 1 so we can see what the camera sees. Okay. You'll notice as I hover over my camera view, if I move the scroll wheel, the camera actually moves. It's dollying in and out. That's what that motion is. When the camera moves forward and back, it's called dollying. If it moves side to side, that's called trucking. All right. Then we can move and rotate and scale the camera. Scaling the camera doesn't actually do anything. It just increases the size of the representation of the camera, but you can see the view itself does not change. So there are 3 different types of cameras. You probably noticed when I went to the Create Camera menu. There's Camera, Camera and Aim, and Camera, Aim, and Up. I'm going to come back to that kind of last. Let's just worry about the basic camera controls first. The first thing we have here is, well, actually we can change between those camera types, but we have angle of view and focal length. And those are the same thing, but represented in different ways. Right? If you change one, it will affect the other. Most of you that have used camera are going to be much more familiar with focal length in terms of camera controls than angle of view. And that's what I would encourage you to stick with. So focal length, you can think of it as lens in millimeters. All right, so this is a 35 millimeter lens. If I increase it to, let's say, 50, it's going to effectively zoom in. So let me move the, we'll move the camera back a bit. Okay. So 50 is going to zoom in. 50 is a standard focal length. It's pretty middle of the road. 35 is more what our eyes see. We can go wider. We can go 24, which is a wide angle lens. We can go, and actually, let me just add a couple of, just for demonstration purposes, I'll add a couple of other objects to the scene just so we can kind of see how they are affected by various camera angles. All right, so go back to the camera. 24 is a wide angle lens. Wide angle goes all the way out to about 16 millimeters. If you go wider than that, then you're getting into fisheye territory, which is like super distorted. We're not, well, it has its uses. It's not a common thing, but it can be a nice stylized effect occasionally. Going the other way, we're back to 50. Okay, now we can see only part of the cylinders that I added. We can go to like 85, and that's 85 is a great kind of, it's a telephoto, but it's still kind of wide. It's a great focal length if you're shooting portraits in real life. So it's a little bit longer. It tends to be flattering for the face. We can go to 120, which is super zoomed in, and 200 if you really want to get that feeling. You see we're much closer. It also, as you increase the focal length, it compresses the frame. Okay, so like here we can see all three. We can see all 3 cylinders and the car, but it feels like a really flat scene, and that's because we're zoomed in. The opposite of that is if we zoom out to, let's say, 24 and move the camera in really close, we can still see all three cylinders, but it's got a greater sense of depth, and that's because of the focal length. I stuck with kind of common prime lens values, but you can just use it as a slider, right? You can go to any number, and you also will notice that as the focal length goes up, the angle of view goes down. So I'll stick with, let's actually go with 24, I think. For the car, it'll be kind of interesting. You can see it feels like it distorts it a little bit, and again, that's the nature of a wide-angle lens. We have camera scale, which we're going to leave at 1. Near clip plane and far clip plane. So clip planes are basically the range that the camera sees. Anything that is closer to the camera than 0.1 Maya units, the camera's not going to see. Same thing if it's further than 10,000 units, the camera's not going to see it. So as I move close and into this car, let me see if I can find like just slightly. All right, you can see how like this windshield, this line is like receding as I get closer. That's the clip plane, right? It's not going to see anything closer than that. Generally, it won't become an issue, but if it does, that's where you make that adjustment. You can also, under the frustum display controls, you can turn on that visualization, okay, if you want to get a better view of exactly how far that the camera can see. Next we have film back, and this is kind of where you set your aspect ratio and film size. So we've got a bunch of different options. Your standard 16:9 HD TV aspect ratio is going to be 1.85 projection. Okay, you're not going to see any difference at first, and that's because we need to also tell Maya that we want to see the film gate, so we know where the edges of our frame are. Right? You can't really position a camera accurately unless you can see where exactly what the camera can see. So to do that, we actually need to scroll down a bit and go to display options and turn on display film gate, and then we also want to turn on overscan to like 1.2. Okay, and so if I just maximize this, now we can see with overscan, now we can see the edges of our frame. The default, and this is where I want all of us to stay for this class, unless you can make a compelling argument that you need to be in super widescreen, like if you want to go 239. 239 is like a super cinematic anamorphic scale. You'll need to maybe bump up the overscan. I'll go like 1.6. Now you can see this is super widescreen. This is 2.39 to 1, which is kind of the standard anamorphic widescreen. But 1.85 is our normal widescreen. I'm going to increase the overscan just a little bit more so that I can see the bounds on this smaller screen. So we'll go to like, let's say 2. Okay, so now I can see the edges of my frame. Really, you just want to set the overscan so that you can see the edges of your frame. That's the important part. And then that's, I think, really all I want to cover with the camera controls. We can look at the other camera types here in a second. Oh, there is depth of field that you can also set. So you turn it on, you can immediately see the preview there. Here you can set your focus distance, so how far away something is what's going to be in focus. So right now the focus is set to 5 Maya units away. I can up that to, let's say, 8. And now the focus is kind of ambiguously in the middle of the windshield. We also have the f-stop, and this is where you can set how much depth of field there is. Okay, so the higher the number, the greater the amount of the scene that's going to be in focus. The smaller the number, the shallower the depth of field. Okay, So you can set this all the way down to like 1 and then barely anything's going to be in focus, or you can increase that a bunch, and you see as we go up to like 54, a lot more of that car is coming into focus. And 64, I believe, is the max. But you can also increase the scale to adjust that further. These numbers won't directly translate to traditional camera f-stops, just because you might end up going higher in the values. Like, you're not going to find a lens that's an f64. You'll find an f22, maybe a 32, but usually not more than that. So that's where you can set depth of field. You can also, if you're not sure exactly where something is in focus, you can either just play around with the sliders. You can also, and this is something I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe if you go to, let's see, I think it's, give me just a second here. So display, heads-up display, object details, and you get this lovely option right here, distance from camera, and that's the number that you enter in your focus distance, and that's what will be in focus. So if we'll move this the camera out away from the cylinders. I'm going to bring the f-stop down so that we have a little bit more of an extreme depth of field. Okay, we'll say f16. Now if we select this first cylinder, you can see it is 8.44 away from the camera. So I'm going to enter that in my focus distance, 8.44. It's already pretty close. And now the center of that cylinder is in focus. If I want this far cylinder to be in focus, I select that, distance from camera, 41.136. Probably doesn't need to be that specific, but we can do that anyway. Focus distance, 41.136. And now that is in focus. Again, we might want to increase the f-stop. You don't want to overdo depth of field, right? You still need to be able to tell what is actually in the scene. You don't want everything blurry. But that's how you can set depth of field. It's real easy. And if we hit render on Arnold, we can take a look at what it looks like. And we're not going to get anything right now because I don't have light in my scene. I'm also not looking through the camera, so I should probably look through the camera. And there we go. And we don't have depth of field. I did wrong. I adjusted the depth of field in the wrong spot. So much like lights, like there's the Maya camera, but there's also Arnold settings for the Maya camera. So right up here where it says depth of field, you can ignore that. That does nothing. We want to scroll down a little bit to the Arnold section. And here we can adjust depth of field. So here's where we can enable depth of field, and we can set our focus distance. So if I set my focus distance to that 41.136, and we want to increase the aperture size. So when it's 0, it's just off. And then as soon as we add some, we can see everything is kind of blurry, except for what's in focus. And as we increase that, we increase the effective depth of field. So aperture size works the opposite of the f-stop. Right? Aperture size is actually increasing the size of the aperture, which is increasing the amount of depth of field. You know, here you can see 0.5 is way too much depth of field, so we need to use a light touch with this. We'll come down to a much more reasonable amount. And let's also change that focus so that the car is in focus. I think that might be a nice thing to do, is focus on the actual subject. So we want 31.238. Go, focus distance, 31.238. And now the front of that car is in focus. And we might go 0.002. Okay, again, use it subtly, but it can really help add some realism to the scenes. So that's depth of field. So last thing that I want to show you is just the other two camera options. So I'll scroll back up to the top of the camera. Under controls, we have camera and aim. The way that works is, I'll just move it, it adds this purple target, and wherever you move the camera, it's going to look at that target. Okay? We can close the render view for now. And you can just see how the camera reacts. It's always going to be pointing at that target. I can move it up and down, I can move it left and right. It's always going to look there. I can also independently position that target. So let's say I want the car to be focusing on, or the camera, excuse me, to be focusing on the wheel. I can move my target to the wheel. Oh, you can see in this view, whoops. We'll go right about, let me grab the camera and move that over. It can be easier to select it too in the outliner. So you can see now we have a camera group. I'm going to choose camera aim. There we go. I'll put that right at the tire. And now as I move the camera around, it's always going to be looking at that tire. And then the last option we have adds one additional control, and that's up. So how this works, and I'm gonna undo. You can see my aim line is off, and that's because I didn't grab the right thing when I moved the aim before. So I'm just gonna undo that back so everything lines up. Okay, so I've got my camera and I've got my aim, and now I have. Oops, where'd it go? Give me the camera. Up, and what up does is allows me to add some camera roll. So if I grab that. Just grab it in the outliner. Now I can move this around and you can see what the result is on the camera angle. It gives me a Dutch angle. So I can, if I want to go a little Dutch there, that's what this off angle is called. It's called a Dutch angle. I'm not sure why. But I can do that, and I can move my aim target, and maybe I want to move the camera in. You see, you can get some really cool effects with the animation too. If you don't want that, then you need to select both objects and then kind of move them in together. Actually select the whole group and move that in closer. Okay, so that's what you can get with the camera aim and up. Usually I'll do like camera and aim, but sometimes it's nice to have that up control as well. The camera, it's best to move the camera not from the camera's view. So if I try to, let's say I want to move the camera aim, I can move it just fine in the perspective view. But if I try to do that in the camera's view, I have less control over it, because it's like compounding the movement, where I move the aim, and when I move the aim, the camera wants to move, which also moves the aim again, and it gets really recursive and confusing. So I would encourage you not to move anything from the camera view, just move it from the perspective view. It'll be you'll have a lot more control over it that way. So that's it for cameras, I believe. Yeah.